You are muted, Martin.
Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. This is already the 5th webinar that we do. And this week we will talk about Greenpeace. I am Bram and I'm one of the moderators of this webinar.
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm the other moderator with Bram. And so we have a lot of cool people from Greenpeace who are going to tell us more about, Greenpeace, about how it started, what they do, their activism, and more interesting stuff. So we have some questions for them, but if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments.
Okay, so maybe a question to all of you first. How are you dealing with the quarantine and what is your function within Greenpeace? Sinja, maybe you can start. Okay,
Hello, I'm Sinja. I'm currently on the Arctic Standbys. I'm a third mate on board. And being honest, for us, the situation did not change so much. So at the moment when the COVID-19 situation became more serious, we just left Montevideo in Uruguay for a big transit, crossing the ocean to Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. So we were in isolation anyway for more than 3 weeks. So it did not have a direct impact. So at the end, when we arrived in Las Palmas, we knew for sure we didn't have the virus on board. So as long as we are on the ship, we can act normally with each other. So for us at the moment, the impact is, I think, a little bit less than for people on land. But we are very, very cautious and very very careful with handling stores we get on board, etc. So we are very, very, very careful about that.
Okay, Matteo, how are you doing?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm doing all right. So I'm a sustainable agriculture campaigner for Greenpeace Belgium. So I work on the meat and dairy campaign. It's a campaign that's focused on reducing the consumption and production of meat and dairy products globally. So it's a global campaign by 50% by 2050. How am I doing personally with the quarantine? Slowly getting used to it. Of course, it's for everyone a big shock and a big change. I miss my colleagues. I miss working at the office. There's been, of course, some adjustments with the campaign, of course, too. There's things we can't do that we used to be able to do, but we're quite a flexible, resilient organization. So I think we're handling it pretty well, and I'm staying positive, and the sun's shining. So all good for now.
Okay, Karen, how is your situation?
Yes, well, my situation is good for now. Touch wood that I don't get ill and people around me don't get ill. I work as a facilitator of the Moving with Movements Trailblazer team. That's a team of 20 people who work for Greenpeace all over Europe and who work with movements, who support movements. So I support that team and I bring them inspiring speakers and I help them do the things they do. And well, since they are all over Europe, all meetings were already through Zoom. So that hasn't changed much. It's just that we don't see our other colleagues anymore. So that's a pity. And of course, we did have to rethink what we were planning to do. So offline big gatherings are not an option anymore. So
Okay, and Amarie, how are you doing?
digital actions.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, we have to be creative. So my function is that I'm coordinating the mobilization and action team. So basically, it means to work with the people power, all our volunteers and activists, and take action mainly in the streets. So it's really challenging for me and for my team in general. So we had to be creative, but I'm quite happy with the solutions that we created, because we've been really busy last weeks. You heard from Peter the last webinar that we managed to do a hologram march in cooperation with Youth for Climate. We make some graffiti a few days ago. So we try to find solution to make people hurt by the government and so on. So I do think it's quite nice. We also relaunch an e-activist team, something that already exists in the past in Belgium. So I do think that we maybe in the long term will have some benefits also from this period.
Okay, so Amaury, another question for you. We see that Greenpeace is in a lot of places. It's one of the biggest environmental movements right now. But how did Greenpeace actually start?
Yeah, so that's a big question because there is thousands of ways to tell that story. And I have to do it short. So my way to explain this, I like to underline the fact that Greenpeace history is the history of the convergence of struggle, merging struggle together from the beginning, and also something really new. Because if we take the first action in 1971, it was really some people, it was less than 10 people going together and deciding to take action against nuclear test in Amchakta. So it's nearby Alaska, done by the US in USA. And that's a beautiful story because it's few people coming together, and some of them had roots of their commitment as activists with the Quakers, and they came with this idea in 1971 to impeach this nuclear test, to take a boat, to buy a boat, and to go more or less where the test will have to happen to impeach it. The concept of this, it's really important to know it's we call this in Greenpeace bearing witness. Even if bearing witness, so it basically it means to denunciate injustice, you go exactly where the injustice is provoked, is done, and to bear witness, and if possible, even to stop it. It's coming from the Quakers, this way of acting. But what was really new, and we can say that in the history of civil disobedience, in the past there was civil disobedience or breaking laws to fight for justice, civil disobedience. It was done by people to free the country. It was done by colored people for their rights. So in the US, it has been done by women for 60 years just to have the right to vote. And Greenpeace, it's the first organization doing that kind of stuff for the environment. Um, so long story, but short, I just want to say that it happened with some people, and then so the name Greenpeace just come from it's the name that they gave to the boat for this activity, and it's only a few years later that they create the organization, and even Greenpeace International, because as you say, people know Greenpeace at the international. It has been created 8 years later in 1979 only, and it was few countries, mostly Western countries, and now it's really a huge international organization. It's I do think 55 country, millions of supporters all around the world, activists and so on. And just to end, I want to underline that what's also interesting in the Greenpeace history is that they do start with this action against nuclear test. And I was speaking about convergence of struggle, and there was two logo on the boat. One, it was the logo peace, so it was against the war, it was for the peace. And another logo, which is not so famous, it's a circle with a line in between, which means it's an ecological logo. So it was about peace, but also about ecology. But from the beginning, it was also this movement has been blessed by the native people in Canada and in USA. This is maybe Cynthia will explain a little bit where the Rainbow Warriors is coming from. It's really coming from the natives people. And I like to insist on this because today, maybe it surprised some people that to see that we are fighting for social justice. We are really insisting on social justice. But why we do this? It's because the global goal of Greenpeace is to tackle the two biggest environmental crises, which are the climate and the biodiversity. But it's two concepts, but it's just one thing. Climate and biodiversity are so much linked that it's just one thing for me. It's two concepts. But to do that, the only way to do it it's also to tackle injustice, social injustice, because we won't fight climate change in a world where there is not social justice. We need everybody on board, and to do that, we need social justice. So sometimes it's big question about convergence of struggle, but it's in the DNA of Greenpeace. Since the beginning, we are trying to merge all the struggles. It's not only about environment.
Okay. Karen and Matteo, as Amory told, Greenpeace has become a movement of millions of people. But is it not hard to work together with so many people worldwide and find common opinions?
I think it's always very hard to work together with a lot of people, but key in it is to give enough autonomy. So in Greenpeace, we have a lot of offices worldwide. All those offices have a big degree of autonomy. They are not obliged to run campaigns. They can start up their own campaigns as well. But we also see the benefit of working all together and having worldwide campaigns, because they create a lot more momentum. So sometimes working together in a worldwide way takes a lot more time. For example, it's taken Greenpeace a very long time to start working around meat. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we have offices in countries where people, where eating meat is a very big part of their culture. And a big part of their economy. So I think all those things, all those factors play a role. Yeah, Matteo, do you have?
Yeah, sure. So I very much agree with what Karen's saying. It can be challenging at times, and I would just add that it can also be very humbling, and it's very necessary, right? So if you're talking about systemic change, if you're talking about climate change, it's something that you can't address in isolation. And also sometimes when you're working on global campaigns, like the meat and dairy campaign, you're talking about a global food system. So um, let's say the impact of importing certain foods or certain raw materials into Europe have massive impacts, let's say in Brazil, when you're talking about soy. And so when you're running a campaign in Europe, you can't run those campaigns in isolation. You have to work together with people. Amory mentioned social injustice. There's a huge component of realizing that the actions and the consequences and the campaigns that you run in one part of the world can have a totally different impact in another part of the world. So it's about finding that balance between kind of local needs and local contexts on the one hand, but then also realizing that if you're working towards global systemic change, then you're going to have to work with the millions, as challenging as that may sometimes be.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah,
sorry.
perhaps sometimes the opinions are that different that we cannot work together, and then another organization gets started, for example, with the Sea Shepherds. I know in the beginning of Greenpeace there were big divides in opinions, and then a new organization got started. And I think we just should embrace that diversity. Not everybody needs to be in one organization. We're one movement, but that doesn't mean we have to be all in one organization. Yes. Go ahead, Alice.
Okay, sorry for that. But so another question for just Matteo this time. So Greenpeace is a big player when it comes down to environmental activism, as we've heard already from all of you. But is the info that Greenpeace relies on and that Greenpeace promotes, is that based on facts, and is it scientifically backed and justified?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So yeah, I mean, Greenpeace is an organization you often see in the media spotlight when we're doing actions, and so people associate Greenpeace very much with our activist work. But yeah, I mean, just to make it very clear, we deeply rely on scientific studies to inform where we act and how we act directly. So you know, in terms of being credible, in terms of being legitimate, in terms of getting millions of people on board, and especially in the long term to maintain that legitimacy and to have that power, we rely heavily on scientific studies, and that's where, you know, that's why, I mean, we do the actions we do today. Just to give you a concrete example, Greenpeace has a scientific unit. So we have the Greenpeace Science Unit, which is based in Exeter in the UK. And so there's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of scientific studies going on behind the scenes, not just in Exeter, but also on our boats. There's a lot of partners that we work with. And for instance, there's a lot of reports that, UN reports, the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's, for instance, a study, about 200 scientists that gets released on a regular basis on climate change. And what's interesting, I think, is if you read those studies and if you look at what the scientists are saying and calling for in their own terms and in their own jargon, they're today what they're calling for is systemic change. So our so-called radicalism is derived from the scientific reports that are very mainstream today. And so it's the same. I mean, it's what Greta Thunberg is saying as well, right? It's listen to the science, listen to the scientists. So our activism, we are an activist organization, but we're grounded in the science, and the science today calls for radical systemic change.
Okay. And how do you bring this information to a larger audience and policymakers in an understandable way?
That can be very challenging. So I can give a specific example, maybe from the meat and dairy campaign. So we work in Europe a lot on European subsidies for industrial farms. So the Common Agricultural Policy, it's a whole pack of money. It's about 360 billion euros every 7 to 10 years that gets pushed towards a certain model of agriculture, towards industrial meat and dairy that we don't support. That's destroying the planet and destroying livelihoods of farmers. And so that's a very complex policy with a lot of different components that can be very complex and very technical. And of course, as a campaign, we work on these technical issues. So we work on calling for more ambitious changes and changing that policy so that the money goes from big industrial players to small scale farms, and that it goes away from meat and dairy towards a more plant-based diet. That's of course very challenging when it gets very technical to communicate that, whether it's to our audiences or whether it's to politicians. You have to break it down. And I think one of the most reliable ways we can probably do that, to make it understandable and to make it relatable to people, is to show how it impacts people's daily lives, and surely also how it's going to impact future generations, right? So if you're talking about the European subsidies, you can ask people, the public money, your taxes, where do you want that to go? I mean, the idea usually with public money is that it goes for public goods. And if you look at the European subsidies for agriculture, public money is not going towards a public good. So it's about asking questions. It's about making it relevant for people. So linking it to stories of local biodiversity. Industrial agriculture is incredibly polluting for waterways and for airways, and incredibly, horrific when you're talking from an animal rights perspective. And so there's different ways that you can reach different audiences. Things that matter to people closer to home, sometimes has an enormous impact, and it also gives people a feeling of empowerment that there's something they can do about it. And the same goes for politicians, right? They respond to their local constituencies, they respond to their voters. So if you can talk to politicians in the language that they understand, which is sometimes the language of votes, and if you can get them to care about the issues we deeply care about, by talking, in more understandable, more relatable ways, and not making it too technical when it's not necessary, then you can really, you can reach these people a lot more profoundly. So it's a great question, because it's definitely not easy, and it's, I say this as if I've got the perfect answer. It's a daily struggle to make complex issues relatable to millions of people, but it's absolutely necessary.
So maybe we can ask some questions about the Greenpeace boat now. So Sinja, when I think about Greenpeace, I definitely think about the ships. And so why does Greenpeace use these boats, and what advantages does using these boats give to Greenpeace as an organization?
Yeah, as Amaury already introduced, one of our basic principles in our organization is bearing witness. And so our boats, we can take them to places where normally people cannot go or where people cannot go easily. And we can go there for documentation, for scientific research, for protesting, and address issues. So since I'm sailing with the Greenpeace ships, I've been to so many amazing places with amazing people, and all around the world. So we've been to the Arctic, frozen in for 6 weeks, incredible, to Antarctica 2018. I've not been on the recent Antarctic campaign, but the last one. And there we took scientists with us, and we did some dive operations, some underwater operations with submersibles to document what is actually the biodiversity, what's the wildlife, wild flora and fauna down to 200, 300, 400 meters depth in the Antarctic. And this is absolutely amazing what we found there. And this is something normally, yeah, how to reach these places, how to go there. And we wanted to show. We took even samples to find out what species are living there, and it is almost as colorful as the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's amazing. We wouldn't have expected that. So everybody was very, very, amazed about that. And with all this, what we found and what we learned about that, we went to the conference. Where a lot of countries were sitting at the same table to try to get the Battle Sea around the Antarctic Peninsula to make it the world's biggest natural reserve. And in the first run, it did not work out the way we wanted because there were a few countries who resigned, but we will have another try. So this is something we can use the ships for, to go to remote places for documentation and for protesting.
Okay. And how is it to live on a Greenpeace ship?
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's beautiful to live and work together with people from all over the world, really all over the world, and sharing a mindset, sharing ideas, sharing so much about what are our concerns, what we're fighting for in a positive way. And it is a very beautiful community, and this is the most beautiful thing to live on the Greenpeace ships, like all these people with dedication and commitment, and with a heart full of activism. This is very, very special to work together with a bunch of people like this. Even with so many different backgrounds, which we have, we can learn so much from each other. It's a very respectful, peaceful, loving culture we have on board, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. It's wonderful.
Okay. And from what I know, boats are not that sustainable. What measures does Greenpeace make to make your boats more sustainable?
We are constantly working on getting the ships greener. So this is about the materials to be used. It's about procedures on board, which we have in place. And we are even doing better than the laws, like are asking for procedures, etc. Because we're Greenpeace, we want to set an example that we can be greener. And I know still at the moment we do have 2 ships of our 3 which are running on diesel oil. But yeah, one of the boats, the Esperanza, is getting old slowly. So there are plans to replace the Esperanza for a greener ship, for a much greener ship. So we're looking into options, what we can do. So there are a lot of different ideas. And there's one option coming up, that we go for a very green, state-of-the-art vessel with a slight ice class, and so she can sail the whole world under sail, of course, under sail, with a very modern rigging, which makes it very efficient to sail. And another option will be getting an old ship and yeah, just rebuild it to make it fit for the purposes of our Greenpeace campaigning. And so there, we're looking into different options, but it definitely will be a sailing vessel or a vessel like rigged up again, which has been prior motor vessel, to go sailing. Whatever we can do, we would want to be sailing to set an example. And I know it's not always possible because sometimes you have to meet the schedule. And so you will take like, yeah, next to the sails, you will have, for example, the e-drive running, which is very efficient system because it goes on the generators. So it's always a compromise because sometimes, yeah, you can't do everything under sail, but like we've got the sailor's heart, and whatever we can sail, we will do. So I see the future becoming greener and greener and greener. So this is what we want to go for. And yeah, we also have to remind just there's the bigger picture, what we are fighting for. And if we can get down the oil industry, like for example, who's going up more and more to the north to find more spots for drilling because the ice is going back in the Arctic. I think we can justify the use of one vessel going there using fuel for sailing there. I think this is something, yeah, you also have to get it into the bigger picture, but the future will be more green. This is for sure.
Okay, so maybe going back to something Matteo said, that we often see in the news really big heroic actions, and that's true. So maybe, Amaury, could you tell us, do these kinds of big actions make sense, and are they justified? And also maybe further, when is it necessary for Greenpeace to take action?
Yeah, it's totally justified and necessary to make it short. What we are fighting for the moment, it's climate justice, and it's to one of the biggest challenge of the humanity. And to do that, to really succeed, we have to keep underground 80% of the fossil fuels that are still existing. For the moment, we are living in a system based on private property and free market that make that big companies have totally the rights to exploit these fossil fuels to make money. And we have to avoid that. So the challenge is really big. And just remember and check history. For the women to have the right to vote, just women have the right to vote. If you just take the first petition in the UK and you compare to the dates that they had this right, it's 62 years of fighting, and they made even more than non-violent direct action. They put the fire in everything that was symbolizing the patriarchy. They've been to jails. They had to make a hunger strike, and they've been forced to eat in the jails just for having the right to vote. The same people with colors has to put their life at risk to have the right to vote in the US and in other countries. So just for common sense, like we are equal with women and with people of color, they have to fight for decades. Uh, Even the right to just work 8 hours a day, it's 1 century of fight. The 1st of May, it's not a party. It's the commemoration of 1 century of fight to have some limits in the working hours. So imagine to do what we have to do now. For me, it's really crystal clear that it's not only petition, it's not only report, it's not only asking nicely that will make things change. So we are really obliged. We have to accept this. Maybe it's not easy to accept it, but the world, and even if we speak about democracy and so on, and that maybe that the rules of this world are not made just by common sense and something that is fair and even scientifically proof. We can have the best report on glyphosate. We can know that the majority of people are against glyphosate and GMO, and still it's happening, and those products are still there. It's because it's just about power dynamic, and those power dynamic, obviously within Greenpeace, we try to build it and to make the people power with legal tactics. And this is why I joined Greenpeace 3 years ago. It's because I've been an activist for years and years, and for me it was a problem to be in action group that just do direct action and don't have the possibility or the maturity that sometimes we need to go on the table and to speak even with our opponents. But I will not work in an organization that just try to lobby, make petition, and to ask nicely, because I don't think it's enough. So this is really the added value, and something that I really appreciate within Greenpeace is that we try with the legal and the classical tactics, but when we see that we won't succeed, then we will take action. And if we have to break the law, we will do it. The specificity of Greenpeace is to do this non-violently. So we try to do this, not putting at risk the security and the integrity of the people that we are facing, and also of our activists. And this non-violent direct action is also really something important for me. So yeah, to make it short, yeah, definitely we need this.
And are there sometimes actions that go wrong or don't go as you have planned?
Yeah, so always, I would say, but it's not so bad. Sometimes the scenario don't happen, but sometimes you have a better success that you expect, and sometimes you have a lot of expectation and you think that you will win the battle with this direct action, and it's not the case. So going wrong, I don't know what does it mean. It can mean a lot of things. Um, uh, but to be honest, I do think it's important to speak about that kind of stuff. But in the Greenpeace history, so it's 50 years that Greenpeace is living, bad action have been happen, especially because we are making action all around the world. And I'm just taking the example of some action that have been hurting and confronting the culture of some other country of population. When we campaign against the seal hunting. Um, when we did that, it raised also protests from the people, the Inuit, we say, people living in the north and so on. But there was other action that has been made and that creates some reaction from population. But what I do like within Greenpeace is that when it happened, Greenpeace recognize it and we try to go further. It's I would say it's normal to make mistakes when you are trying to change the world, when you have to act quickly, and but yes, at least we learn from our mistakes, and it makes the movements bigger. I would say. And sometimes maybe I can give the word to Sinja, because in the boats there is a lot of action, and so there is a lot of confrontation. And so I don't know if you mean that something can go wrong when there is some confrontation, but I think it's complex to answer that question. So I don't know what Sinja think about that.
It's indeed a very complex question. I mean, we are planning the actions as carefully as possible. We do a risk assessment because we don't want to put anybody on unnecessary risk. And then we take everything we can imagine into consideration. So there's a big process to set up an action beforehand. And actually, you don't have only one scenario. So if one plan you have might fail, you have to have plan B, you have to have plan C, plan D, E, F. You have to be prepared for every situation you could imagine, like when it's going a different direction, which is not expected. But even then, if you've got 6 plans, like as a backup already, things can go totally differently. And you have to be able to act on that, to be flexible, to be improvising. And this is often, I think this is one of our big strengths. So very experienced activists and action coordinators and teams, they are like, at the moment, they have to take decisions and just like change within the action to still transport the message and to still show protest. And this is one of our Greenpeace qualities, that we've got so much experience around, so many skilled, experienced people here. who are very very good improvisers. So yeah, things can go wrong. I agree. I mean, it can be simply be equipment which is failing, because yeah, you can have technical issues, but it also, you might not be prepared of the behavior of the people you encounter in your actions, which is totally out of what you were thinking of. So can change from moment to moment, and you have to act on that. And I think we are doing very well on that to improvise. Yeah, there's a lot of improvising skills around, so I'm always impressed by that.
Okay, so a question for Karen now. Greenpeace started as a movement, as a small movement, but now it became a really big NGO. And how does Greenpeace support other climate movements and grassroots organizations? Does that experience of growing into a big organization help them, or?
Yes, well, we've been working on ecological issues since the 70s, so that's 5 decades of working for the common good. And if there's one thing we've realized, then it is that we cannot do it alone. There's a quote within Greenpeace that says we've won important battles, but we are losing the war. So if there's one thing we're very conscious about, it's that we will have to work together. We cannot do this just as one organization, even if we're already a very, very big organization. So when we do things, we will reach out to other organizations, and we will reach out to just like all people who are there and who want to join us. And we do not want our supporters to just be supporters if they also can contribute in other ways. So we try to involve as many people as possible in as many ways as possible. How exactly do we support them? For example, when you had the big climate march on the 2nd of December in 2018, the Claim the Climate, there were colleagues of mine who started putting a lot of organizations together around the table and helping with the day-to-day organizing. So setting up meetings, helping very good, distribute posters. It also happened with, for example, the air protest, clean air protest. So Greenpeace had done important work for a documentary film on air quality in Belgium around schools, and then parents started protesting 2 days after that, I think, at school gates. And so people from Greenpeace reached out to them because they have the same cause as we did, and we started seeing what they did and asked how we could help. And gradually with time, we helped them organize a very big bike tour from Antwerp to Brussels, or we help them distribute posters again. It can be logistical things, but it can also be help think about strategic things. We can offer training. We have, for example, press contact trainings that are very well liked in the movement. We have civil disobedience training. Many ways. We also helped Youth for Climate, but we were very cautious because even before we got involved with Youth for Climate, there were people in the news saying that Youth for Climate was all set up by Greenpeace, and we were a bit scared of putting them in a bad daylight. So we waited a bit longer to help support Youth for Climate, but we, for example, helped when there was the festival at To a Taxi at the end of all the strikes. Every once in a while they called for a stage, and we helped put up a stage. Sometimes we help financially. There's many ways. And we do pay a lot of attention to not co-opt, meaning we are a very big organization, and then there's always a danger that people, even though other organizations are contributing just as much, there's always a danger that then the press talks about a Greenpeace action. Because there happens to be our logo on it too. So that's why sometimes very often we decide not to put our logo on things. It's not because we do not want to be transparent. It's just because we're afraid that then things will be branded in the news as a Greenpeace action, which is a good thing for us, but not for the movement. And we want other organizations and other people's efforts to be recognized just as much. And yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it definitely did.
Yeah.
So now we will ask the last question to our panel members. So for the viewers, you can ask questions in the chat, and then we will ask them to our panel members after this last question. So don't hesitate to ask your questions. So now the last question. What's the biggest victory Greenpeace has achieved for you? Maybe Amarie, you can start with it.
Yes. So okay, that's it. Difficult question once again. There is plenty of victory within Greenpeace history. I will advise, and maybe I can put it in the chat, and then you can copy it in the Facebook. There is a timeline that has been produced, and you can, or if you write just Greenpeace victory timeline, you will see how many victories we achieved, and we don't speak enough about those victories. It's important to see to speak about them. So there is a lot of them, and just once again to flag that it takes time to have a victory. The Wales, the treaty against nuclear test, it took 25 years for Greenpeace to win that campaign. So there is a lot of them, but if I have to pick one, and it's not a topic that I really know, but in the beginning of the history of Greenpeace, in the 70s and 80s, they also fight against the fact that Western countries and companies were throwing nuclear waste in the seas, at seas, in the ocean, and especially they were doing this not around the coast of the Western countries, but the coast of the Africa and so on. So just an example that after few years of battle, they win this, and there was a treaty to ban to drop nuclear waste in the seas. I appreciate that kind of victories, because it's not only about environment, but it's also about global justice between the global north and the global south. So it's because Greenpeace doesn't speak a lot about inequalities between north and south, but we can see that behind those environmental action, there is always something about justice between industrialized Western countries and the global south. So this is the kind of victories that I'm quite proud that we achieve with Greenpeace. But if I cheat a little bit, I would also say that victories, it's not always when you change a law. It's also in the pathway. It's also in the movement building. And for me, every time that just Karen spoke about working with others, every time we succeed to work with partners, for me it's a victory, because Greenpeace won't change the world all alone. So we need to be a movement. So I do think that are also great victories in the pathway, I would say.
Okay. Sinja, maybe you can also answer this question.
Yeah, thinking about it, one thing popping up from my mind directly is the action. It was in the 90s when I was still a kid, or youth, in the Brent Spar. So when the Greenpeace team has occupied the Brent Spar platform for, I think it was 3 weeks at all, and actually what they achieved was that there came laws and new regulations that all platforms are not allowed to be scrapped at sea, but have to be dismantled at land. So there's no oil pollution, or much less oil pollution to the seas. And this has been a very big thing. And I remember when I was a kid, I was watching the news every evening, and what are the Greenpeace guys doing? And it was amazing just to follow the whole story. So this is something like, it was for me so inspiring. And yeah, this is the thing which is popping up in my mind. But just as Amaury said, it's a timeline, so there's so much to tell. And yeah, well, this is the story just for me, which is so inspiring. One of the hundreds, but very important one for me personally.
Okay. Matteo, what is for you the biggest victory of Greenpeace?
It's a really difficult question. I'd start by saying I agree largely with what Amelie is saying, especially on, and I think Karen wanted to join on this too, but the more unbranded movement building being let's say a larger partner for a lot of smaller organizations, upcoming movements, is probably in the last year is probably our biggest success. It's not necessarily one campaign. It's not a box we've ticked. It's not work that is finished, but it's something that I'm personally probably most proud of, in the sense that we've become part of a larger movement, especially since, as Anne-Marie pointed out in the beginning, so Greenpeace was very much one of the first kind of environmental activist group, and so at least in the 70s and 80s, everyone would always turn to Greenpeace. And now, luckily, there's a lot more organizations that work around environmental issues. And so people sometimes ask me, don't you think Greenpeace is less relevant today because we might not have the same media coverage that we did in the 80s or 90s? But in many respects, our role has changed, I think, for the better. It's not about always being branded and being in the spotlight and being, the taking all the praise for whatever quote unquote success we've had. It's ultimately about systemic change, which is much bigger than Greenpeace and is much bigger than our brand. Having said that, there are a few concrete examples that I think in the last decade show that we can have on a very quickly a big impact. And the one that comes to mind for me, which is slightly related to the meat and dairy campaign, but before we started the meat and dairy campaign, is the Detox My Fashion campaign, which was a campaign about phasing out hazardous chemicals that you can find in your clothing, right? So in Adidas clothing, for example, or in Nike clothing. And there was a very targeted campaign, which I think started in 2011, directed at these companies to phase out a list. I think it was 11 chemicals. So it was a very specific campaign focusing on, I think, 100 or so companies, asking them for a very specific need and being very direct in our communication. And I think in the past, especially, we've been very successful with these types of campaigns of calling out specific companies with specific objectives. Now, of course, that's part of systemic change. It's not everything, but it's a very good example of, I think, most of these companies have now, out of the 11 chemicals that we identified, have eliminated most of them. So they had, I think, a deadline for 2020, and most met that deadline, which is a nice example of kind of the public pressure that we can have on a very short. I mean, 9 years doesn't sound short, but with some campaigns, if you can succeed with something like that in a time frame of 10 years, that can be a big success sometimes. So I'd say if I needed to pick out a specific one, that would be the one.
Okay, and Karen, what is for you the biggest victory Greenpeace has achieved?
Well, if you ask me the biggest one, well, there's one that comes to mind, and it's pretty recent in a sense. I not so long ago, I saw a small newspaper article about the last hole in the ozone layer that was closed. And that's not just a victory of Greenpeace, but of the entire ecological movement. For years, has been campaigning on the holes that were forming in the ozone layer, and then there's been big political meetings that in the beginning didn't go far, but in the end they decided to stop producing the gases that created those holes in the ozone layer. And worldwide, everybody stopped producing those gases. And now, even though it's years later, we see that nature has restored itself. And so I think that's really, really great. If you wouldn't have had all those actions, we would have we would have been having a lot of skin cancers. We would be in great trouble. So that's a very nice victory. And if I could, then if I can, I would also like to add another victory, and that is what we're seeing in Brussels for the moment. There's been a lot of protests around air quality, a lot of protests around climate. And what we're seeing in the city of Brussels now is that there's going to be there is a bike lane now in one of the biggest traffic axes of the entire city. And when I look at the pictures, it almost brings tears to my eyes. It's the lanes where we marched, and now there's a red carpet for the bikes. So I think it's a small victory, but it shows a major shift in how our policymakers are thinking of, our politicians are thinking of Brussels. The city center, the Pentagon, or how do we call it in English? It's becoming a zone where you can maximum drive 20 kilometers an hour, and every pedestrian will have priority over car drivers. So that's a major shift for Brussels. Perhaps a small one for the world, but yeah, we're getting there.
Okay, so now we have had all the questions we have prepared for our panel members. So now we will go over to the viewer questions. Alice, maybe you can start with the first question.
Yeah. So we have one question, and it was, how does the future look like for Greenpeace, and how will the climate crisis affect how you work as a global organization? So maybe Amaury, do you want to start?
Yeah. No, once again, I'm always saying difficult question because the world is changing so fast that I can say how we are looking at the future right now, but maybe in 2 years we will change it because we have to adapt. We didn't foresee the COVID crisis, and it will have a big impact on the world in general, on the mindset of the people, on what is possible to do as movement. On our democracy. So definitely it's really difficult. But if I can just try to one thing is that about the climate, I will make a caricature. Maybe it will create a debate, but in the climate movement, you have different way to see at the future, and there is some movement that I would say that we will agree that those are our opponents, but there is all those people, companies, and maybe countries that do believe that the technology and the capitalism and the change that the capitalism can have, and the technology will save us. So it's the green capitalism vision. It's a little bit an optimistic vision that, okay, we don't know for the moment, but we'll find a solution. We'll find something else to replace oil and so on. So Greenpeace has not that vision, but Greenpeace has not neither the vision of the catastrophe. There is a movement which is coming bigger and bigger that I'm reading a lot about it, the collapsology. So the fact that it's lost, humanity will die in few years, and it's lost. And the only thing that maybe we have to think about is how we want to live in a world that will collapse, and that we will maybe just have millions of people, not 7 billions, but millions of people, and to think the world after, and it doesn't work to fight. Greenpeace is a little bit in between this. We are not saying it's too late, and we are not optimistic to say we'll find a solution. We are saying the situation is really bad, but there is still hope at the condition that we fight all together. This is where I place Greenpeace in the diversity of the movements for the moment.
Karen, do you want to add to the answer?
Me? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I very much like the concept of radical hope, which is hope when there's almost none. You keep your hope as a decision, even if everything around you points that it's going to become very, very difficult, and that maybe you will lose the battle, you still cling to whatever hope there is, even if there's none, because you can create self-fulfilling prophecies, and then hope grows the more you hope. So yeah. So, and when it comes to the future, I think in the future we will continue to work more and more with movements, and we will see more movements. I think we will see Extinction Rebellion grow. That will be a great partner for us. I think Fridays for Future will continue. I don't think the climate fight will go away. It will become bigger still. So even if there's COVID now, things will get harder, and so people will revolt even more. So yeah.
Okay. Now another question, which is a bit more critical. It's from Paulo Silva. I will just read the question. Greenpeace is anthropocentric, ignores the feelings and suffering of non-human animals and their right to live as individuals and not as objects for humans to use. Isn't this a form of denialism and injustice for someone who claims to be based on science and want to correct the injustices in the world? Is someone willingly to answer this question?
I nominate Matteo.
So I'm assuming this question is perhaps, or maybe that's just what I'm reading into it because I'm a meat and dairy campaigner. Is I can answer it from a sustainable agriculture perspective and from how we run our campaign. Let me start off by maybe restating what Greenpeace's global objective is for sustainable agriculture and how that fits in a wider ecosystemic perspective. So we focus as an organization on reducing the consumption of meat and dairy and the production of meat and dairy by 50% by 2050. Rightly, or of course, there will be organizations and individuals that can that will point out or that will ask the question, and they often do, why does Greenpeace not support a transition towards vegan agriculture, right? Why do we support for -50, -100? Are we choosing -50, for example, because we think that's only as much as we can possibly ask for by 2050? And to cut a long answer short, no, we don't choose -50% because we don't think we can get -100%. We choose -50% because we believe in what's called an agroecological system, right? So that's a system in which livestock, in which animals have a role to play in the wider carbon cycle, which is our food system. Does that mean that we discourage plant-based diets or vegan diets? Absolutely not. If you think -50% doesn't sound ambitious, we're talking -80 to 90% in the developed world, right? And the reason we choose an agroecological model is because of essentially that carbon cycle. When it comes to agriculture, one of the things we fundamentally cannot ignore is the role of soil health and the role that soil can play in sequestering carbon, in trapping carbon, in capturing carbon. So agroecology is all about creating a farming system that replicates, that mimics nature, right? That mimics the complexity of nature. And when we look at natural systems, there is a role for especially ruminants, for grazing animals. So here we're talking cows or bison or goats, that they play in this wider ecosystem. And I know that's a very complex answer, and I know your question was more directed about, that we're very kind of, human-centered as an organization. But I think it's about understanding or reevaluating the role that other species have to play in a wider ecosystem and our role in it. It's not to discourage individuals from going vegan or from going vegetarian or choosing individual diets that reflect their ethical beliefs. But from a wider systemic perspective, there is a very strong environmental argument to make for an agroecological and not necessarily a veganic agricultural system. Now, I don't want to take up too much space here. It's a very interesting debate, and especially from an ethical perspective, I can totally see where you're coming from if I'm interpreting your question correctly, because I'm taking this through my sustainable agriculture lens, of course. But it's something that we really we have to stand behind, because it's the position that science backs. If you look at kind of where the Food and Agricultural Organization stands today, where the IPCC stands today, the way to work towards a durable and sustainable, in the true sense, agricultural system is to turn towards agroecology, which, I repeat, is a model that is drastically less dependent on meat and dairy, and when there is no space for industrial meat and dairy production. So I'm not trying to defend any of the practices that are currently taking place. They're horrific when you look at factory farms and the conditions. It's a totally different world we're living in. But I'm also not afraid to stand behind the stance that we stand behind, and we don't do that out of a lack of ambition or a lack of belief in a different system. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, I love having this debate. So you can contact me separately, or Bram, maybe you can send him my details, and we can have a chat about this later. It's a fascinating one, and definitely not a simple one to reduce to 5 minutes. So hope I started to at least answer your question there.
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Matteo. So Paulo Silva, if you still want to discuss this with Matteo, then you can send a message to Youth for Climate, and then we will connect you with Matteo.
Okay, so now we have another viewer question from 16 Janoli. What is your opinion about violent protests? Do you think it might be an interesting way of protesting? So is there a volunteer to answer this question? No? Okay, maybe Sinia, do you want to answer it?
About violent protest. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what we not do, definitely. So yeah, another basic principle, just we are a non-violent campaigning organization. So this is what we definitely not do. We don't want to hurt anybody. We don't want to hurt property as much as possible. So this is, we're not going to change into this direction, even if some people might think maybe it will be more, it will have more impact. I know that some of the other NGOs, they do, and they're also quite successful in that. And there's some people who support that a lot. But I think Greenpeace will not change that way. So definitely not.
Okay, I see Karen also wanted to add, I think, to it. You're muted, I think.
Yeah, I think an important reason not to use violence is because we rely on people power, and we rely on changing people's hearts and changing a very big number of people, changing a big number of people's hearts. And I think violence is a very big ethical red line for many people. And when you start violence, you will not, you lessen the chance that you will actually convince people. You will not convince the public, and you will not convince the people in power. In the end, we have to convince people, and convincing people requires winning their sympathy for your cause. When you, yeah. And with violence, it becomes very easy to discard an entire organization, an entire movement. And I hear more and more people in the climate movement advocating for the use of violence, and I'm actually really scared of that. I am afraid it will have an impact on how police will be toward us, how the general public will be towards us, and it will not only be towards those specific groups that use the violence. I'm afraid it will generalize, and it will be more polarizing than would be good for the cause. Of course, opinions differ on that, but I really feel strongly about it, and I'm very happy that the peace is so deeply embedded in the DNA of Greenpeace. So I'm sure that if I associate myself to Greenpeace, that violence will never be part of our action.
And I think Amory also wanted to add, but maybe if we can do keep it a little bit short.
Yeah, I think we have to avoid to answer with an ideology to that kind of question. Will violence save the world or do the opposite? Sometimes you ask me, what about civil disobedience? Is it necessary? Sometimes I also answer that if we could not use civil disobedience and just if we had the opportunity to speak directly at lunchtime with the people who has the power, and we have millions of dollars to pay full study and to rewrite the common agriculture policy, we will do that instead of disobeying. So sometimes I do that. Civil disobedience is the weapon, is the tactic of the poor, of the middle class. But there is other groups that don't even have the privilege that we have as Greenpeace, or of even when I'm struggling with other grassroots movement. So for the other people, it's not a question. They just have the power of their muscles and to react, and to use violence is the only way that they can be heard and they can take action. So we have to analyze who is taking action and why are they violent, instead of answering violence is bad or violence is good. And obviously Greenpeace will be always non-violent because we have the privilege to be non-violent. But it's not easy to answer that when we are not in a webinar, but when we just have 2 minutes on television and so on. So it's really difficult to answer that. But I hope I am not the only one to think within Greenpeace in general, that if we have to choose to point the fingers at the people using violence, or saying that, okay, um, we are thinking that they are part of a movement, they use different tactics, it's not our tactic, but we can understand why they are using violence. I think we are going in the right direction. Someone was saying, it was I just say that évêque in Latin America, there is 3 forms of violence. There is the first form is the violence of the system, the state and the companies, and this is the worst one. This is the biggest violence. Is the violence of the system we are living in. There is a second form of violence. Is some people trying to organize and defend themselves against that violence. And there is a third form of violence. Is the violence of the state, of the police, and of private company to how do you say that, to repress, to fight back this defense of the people. And the problem is that we are most of the time speaking about the second form of violence of people trying to defend their rights and their dignity. We should spoke more about the violence of the system and the repression when people try to be heard by any means.
Okay, so now we will go over to the last viewer question. Just to know, if you still have questions after this webinar, you can always contact us, and then if possible, we will connect you through with the right person of Greenpeace. So the last question is from Peter. How do you bring together the Gilets jaunes and Gilets verts? You almost never have common statements with unions. Is someone willing to answer this question? No. Maybe Karenis?
I think that is one of the big challenges for Greenpeace in the future. We need to, well, we're already trying to work together more with the unions. And we've been at the same actions with Gilets jaunes, not a lot yet, but it has happened already. If there's one of the big learnings of the last elections is that it's that social justice and ecological justice should really go together. And Amory has stated it a couple of times before. We want to unite those different battles. And if I look at the strategies and the plans for the upcoming years at Greenpeace, it's really clearly written there that we will also focus on social issues and social justice. So if there's anybody of the unions or anybody of the Gilets Jaunes who's watching, please get in touch because we really want to work together. We have meetings already with the unions. They're part of the Climate Coalition. There's a very big international day in June coming up of the unions about climate change. So it's the 24th of June. So both the unions and us are both realizing that we should work together more. So
if I can just
Yeah.
say something really short, because it
Yeah.
has been said in the question that we never go together, but it's not true.
Yeah.
By the way, the Coalition Climat, we are part of the Coalition Climat, and there is unions. So any statement of the Coalition Climat, it's a common position of environmental NGOs such as Greenpeace and also unions. And more specifically, Greenpeace, last year we had the Rainbow Warrior in Belgium, and it has been the opportunity to meet more the unions, and we write some statement about, and we build solution together, solutions that are good for the planet and good for the people. So we've been through that. We have to go deeper, and we will.
Thank you. So I think that just about wraps up the webinar of today. So we want to thank everybody who watched the webinar and thank the panelists as well for the really interesting answers to all the questions. And then maybe Bram wants to add something.
Yeah, next week we will have a very special webinar. Adelaide, who went herself to the Amazon via a sailing boat, has created a very special webinar about the Amazon and about all the things that are going on there during Corona. And she has arranged some very special speakers. So I would advise you all to watch to our Facebook page because it will be very special. And then we see you next week. Thank you all for watching.